Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of Gans processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Let's see here. Welcome, everybody. This is the Kish American Knowledge Team meeting in 2025. And it's a very important time in our lives, isn't it? Very important time to be here and do all the things that we need to do. So let's see here. Yeah, we have a very good representation here from the many continents around this planet. It's really important because this is a worldwide event. We're following the massive announcements of the Knowledge Seekers workshops. And we're trying to, shall we say, make heads or tails. Let's understand the heads are very magnetical and the tails are very gravitational. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We're discussing the intermediate Gans tech. And as part of that is the Pico Gans. And my name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is November the 16th of 2025. This is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So thank you all for participating, because we are all not just knowledge seekers, not just students, but we will also become teachers, and we have to become teachers in our own way. And as we try and condense this information into bite-sized pieces, we find that we have a cornucopia of bite-sized pieces. And, you know, how do we make heads or tails out of this whole thing without running around like a dog trying to catch its tail? So the anomaly has come about because as we've been going through the Gans tech here, we've been talking about the transaction zone, which is the coming together of two fields and how they counterweight each other. So there's always a balance. And then it's a way of how do we interpret what we're seeing? And then one of the ways we interpret things is through shielding. And so one thing that it does is it shields us also from the knowledge, because it exposes us to the improper knowledge. And so we have to understand that our Earth space is already shielded. We don't need intermediaries to shield that. What we're having is a refugium, a place of peace and prosperity. We call it heaven. And we say heaven on earth. And many people don't agree with that concept, because when you look around, you see all sorts of hooligan activity that is not very productive. But the reality is that We didn't go to Mars. We came to Earth and we arrived. And we are all little Pico Ganses on a very big planet. And there's over 8 billion of us. And we come here for a very specific reason. And we need to find out what that reason is. So we've been trying with the books of Marin Tabakoli Kesh, such as book number 1, which is the universal order of creation of matter. And now we understand it's the coming together of 3 energy fields, the matter, the dark matter, and the antimatter. And that's well described. And so when it's the coming together, then the question is, where's it coming from? And so we have 2 fields. And then how do we connect those 2 fields? Well, of course, in book number 2, it's the structure of the light that allows us to connect these 2 fields. And do we understand light? And quite honestly, physics has been dependent on this understanding. And unfortunately, there has been a deficiency because we've been only looking at it from the physical point of view. We're already complaining in the Knowledge Seekers workshops that we're viewing life from the matter state point of view. And we've been trying to discern what is the difference between the matter state and the physical state. So the physical state is the product, is the inertia field product of the matter state. So what is the matter state and where did it come from? So in book number 3, The Origin of the Universe shows where that came from. And so the creation of these 2 fields, which create this inertia field of physicality, is our universe, which we understand totally. Well, we think we understand it totally because the only thing that we understand is that little tiny drop in the ocean of man's universe. And we think we know everything. And all we know is what we see, which is the color of light. But what we don't see is not only the rest of the universe, but we also don't see our sister universe, which is the counterweight to our universe. So we find that 2 fields can be created from the 1 field. And that 1 field is going back to book number 1. And so this all leads us to a lot of confusion. And the reason we have this confusion is because we are, as members of the Universal Council brought forward by Rick Crammond and those members on the 404 One Planet, One Nation, One Race for Justice and World Peace, we find that we are having a meeting with ourselves because the Universal Council is having a meeting by themselves and basically excluding us. And so how do we become members of the universal community? And is there a universal community? Well, we have to understand that the plasma rule is where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, and our rule on Earth is the higher strength eats the weaker strength. So when these 2 fields come together, that is a transaction zone. But the thing is that in science, we call that a binding zone. But in our Earth space, it always leads to a kind of conflict point. So whether it be 2 armies coming together and having a conflict, or a husband and wife in a marriage having a conflict, or brother and sister, or even brother and brother, and then we see that there's a conflict point in even there. So, we see many examples of conflict points. And of course, it's only in physics and that we look at them as a binding zone. And in terms of that binding zone, most of us are preoccupied with the unbinding of the binding zone through massive explosions. And we create these bombs, which, of course, promote killing. And that's really the problem on this planet, is we all need this energy binding. It's a very self-serving need, and that gives us our dimension point. But it's how we acquire this energy binding, and we do it at the expense of others who also depend on this energy binding need for their self-serving purposes. So why, when we were given all the resources that we need to facilitate this energy binding, are we stealing it from others? And so we find ourselves in this anomaly. And then, what do we call ourselves? Well, we call ourselves the fallen angels. Why? Because it increases density and increases pressure, it increases gravity, it increases our dependence on the Earth space feeding, and then puts a lot of pressure. And so we find that this pressure is like an internal popcorn pressure of Gans intensity. But you see, the thing is that the angular momentum is conserved. And you know that because as we, shall we say, explode like popcorn, we retain our conformity in our body. So what stopped that explosion? How come we're not splattered all over the place? Well, when someone drops a bomb on you, you splatter all over the place because that's an external energy which is not accounted for in this angular density. So fundamentally, without intervention, our angular momentum is conserved. In other words, we can manifest our physicality and maintain our conformity within our body structure and still have the, shall we say, Gans affinity that we need. And so we can do this, as we talked last week about the shielding, but we see shields as an armor. Sometimes we see it as a weapon. And we see that as part of our exoskeleton because we don't have enough to shield us. And, so you see police and military walking around with bulletproof vests as a shield, but it also gives us camouflage. It also, deception is another type of shielding. And then, of course, if the shielding doesn't work, let's just divert attention. So that's a different form of shielding. But then there's the translucence. In the sunlight, we can see the sky, but at night, that same sky becomes translucent. We can see the stars. And so we know that there's an area beyond that shielding. That shielding is actually our Coulomb barrier, which serves as a protection from all the viruses that are going around the world and through the universe. So we call them viruses because they're just energy packs. And they manifest into bacteria, which is the physical manifestation of the virus. And so when we come through this zone, that shield can act as a catch-all. So we catch all these things, but they're on the outside of the barrier, and that's how we can shield ourselves. So that is a physical fact. But we seem to be fascinated with all sorts of phenomena, and we like to, well, we like to be fashion dandies, riders on the storm, right? So to impress the impressionable. And so we call them in our own language, if we can't explain it, we say what we call chariots of fire, right? Chariots drawn by horses with flames coming out of the exhaust of the chariot. Right then and there, you know that there's a problem because we're trying to explain something and we don't have the terminology, we don't understand the science. So, we sometimes lash out, and that lashing may be a loosh dilemma where we start harvesting the loosh from others, which is the energy. And by stealing that, we have a single-minded intention. That is, I like your honey and I want to steal your honey because I think your honey is better than my honey. And then we get more people thinking about that. And that's how you get this hive mind intention. But this is part of the loosh dilemma, where this hive mind is thinking with the physical inertia results. It is not obeying the Gans intention, which is really the true nature of man. And the true nature of man is in conflict with this loosh dilemma. And it kind of obstructs our vision, doesn't it? So what we're looking for is vitality enhancement. And why do we need vitality enhancement? Because fundamentally, we are all loosh leakers. And so we need to recharge at our gas stations to improve our emotional and physical vitality, and we know how to do that using the Ganses. And we have many types of technology coming forward that are seeking the practical applications of this. So we are confronted with what are historical wagon wheels and our current automotive industry and our airplanes, rocket ships, and spaceships. Quite the range. And how do we cope with this when we are manifesting old and decrepit people? Why are those two words, old and decrepit, in the same sentence when we're also manifesting young and decrepit people? And why are those two words in the same sentence? Does age and health have a relationship? Or is that contrived? Well, there are many things that are contrived. So when we look at the Ten Commandments, we find that they are the Ten Commandments for humanity, not for the vertical people, not for dogs and pigs and cats. It's for us. Why do we need these Ten Commandments? Are we not intelligent enough? Or are the dogs, pigs, and cats more intelligent than us? And then we find that there's more missing commandments. And I keep referring to thou shalt not lie because poker is a very popular game in this planet. But lying is a game of deception. And it's only possible on this planet within that Coulomb barrier. Once you go past that, you cannot lie because words don't matter. Words are physical. And the universal community is looking at your true intention. So that true intention is manifest in the Gans. The Gans has an affinity for truthfulness. There's no poker playing in outer space. And so this becomes the truth seeker's dilemma. When I see that you're lying, I have to have an accountability to myself. But, do I accuse you of lying or do I have to shield myself from lying? And why do I have to shield myself? You're the liar. But there's a liar's dilemma as well, because they have an accountability as well to their soul. And so the dilemma there is they either have to quit lying or suffer the consequences, because there are always consequences. So this is the nature of the Gans shielding points, what we talk about. The humanity inertia, Gans, to shield ourselves from hostiles, from aggression, from environmental harm, from fear-mongering, from emotional abuse. This demonstrates an enormous amount of activity and energy dedicated to the shielding process. But where is the peace and prosperity thriving when so much energy is devoted to the shielding process? So one of the ways to shield ourselves, of course, is to exclude ourselves from that particular social sphere. So let's say, if you're a gang member, you have to be part of the gang or you're not going to survive. So in order to survive differently, you may have to change the field of the gang, or you may have to change the field of your presence, and you have to move away from that field. And there are many people who are basically going around this planet who have extricated themselves from that environment and gone into a different environment, but they constantly have to maintain this shield to shield themselves from this aggression and from hostiles. And so this is our preoccupation on this planet. And it's unfortunate because it's very easy to change the perception. Because when we introduced the cups of life, it was during a pandemic. And so, but they weren't called the cups of pandemic, they were called cups of life. Why is that? And that is because our inner space reflects our core space, and it gives us an emotional strength, and we can enhance that. Likewise, we can enhance our physical strength. This is all part of our vitality enhancement. So we had two cups of life. And that was interesting because one was emotional, that would be the zinc, and one was physical, that would be the copper Gans. But then we introduced the radiance manifestation of other Ganses like CO2 and calcium and amino acids and water. And now we've extended that to include gold. And what are the ramifications of that? But not only, there are many that are coming into play. And then we have the anomaly of the cup of the universe, which includes the two hemispheres of the brain. And they work together the same way. There's a balance between the copper Gans, which is physical, and the zinc Gans, which is emotional, and the carbogen, which is, wait a second, that is connected to the universe. And all three of these Gans fields are working together, and they create the physicality. But the physicality isn't just the addition of these three fields, it's more than that because we retain the continued operation of these three basic fields. So our transmission is our physicality on the carbon 12 highway, but then we can transition to the carbon 14 highway, and that is just a midpoint to the transmutation highway, which is the carbon 16 highway. And then we find that there is a relationship between all of our atomic structure, our monatomic structure, our Gans structure, and today we're going to discuss our Pico structure. So what we like to review is to understand that the cups of life involve the basic magnetical gravitational relationship and the soul radiance. So we have the emotional cup, the physical cup, and the soul cup. But in order to manifest in the physicality, we have to have an environment. That environment is our earth space. So once we have that environment, then our soul cups can all interact with the cup of inertia, which is the manifestation of that inertia field density. So we're bringing together all of these things, and we find that something is something. Nothing is nothing. Based on the field strength, something is always something as opposed to being something else. We call it susceptibility. And the transaction zone is right in the core where these fields come together. It is one. And so we look at the cup on the left and we can see the beginnings of that transaction zone. You can clearly see the rotating, the circular patterns, if you will. And they're contained within this glass cup at the bottom of the liquid. And we look at the carafe on the right, and so we have the glass, we have the water, we have the Gans, and then look, there's a hole in the Gans. And that becomes another transaction zone. So the completion of these circular fields. And you say, well, there's nothing in there. Well, no, nothing is nothing. Something is always something as opposed to being something else. So here we are when we do the nanocoating, and in review, we took a copper wire and then we created carbon nanocrystals. And then we had to align them. And then we created this magnetical gravitational relationship. And once we made that gravitational inertia point and we gave it an alignment, then we could have a direction of flow. And flow is what it's all about because that is how you transfer energy through these MAGRAV energy transfer states. So it all follows the laws of conservation of inertia. And so we can not only go from one side of the Gans state to another side of the Gans state, but we can also interact with the Gans state on one side and the nano state on the other side. But there's no restriction to that. We can also interact with the atomic state. And so we find that there is something funny going on here. There's this Pico turning point in the center. And it is somehow positioned in the center of the atomic state, nanostate, and the Gans state. And so there's a relationship, and we'll discuss that today. So the first thing is that we understand that the reason the Gans is freaking out because it's like a Gans popcorn. And when it pops out from a core. And so all the points on the Gans have a negative charge, each point being negative as a giver. And as a giver, it's magnetical. This represents field forces. Where are they coming from? Well, that positive charge in the gravitational core. And in that core, we have gas. So the Gans is gas as a nanostate, solid. Gas is a nanosolid. And so when it explodes, it manifests into that physicality, and we can see it. And that's the key point, because the gravitational aspect of the Gans freakout is the Pico coating, which is a popcorn of its own. We have a Pico popcorn, except we can't see it. We actually can't even see the nanocoating. The only way we can see the nanocoating is when we have 40,000 layers of nanocoating, and then we can see the blackness. But we can't even see the Pico because it's 3 orders of magnitude smaller than the nano. So let's remember, milli is 10 to the minus 6, nano is 10 to the minus 9, so Pico is 10 to the minus 12th. It is tiny, tiny, tiny. And yet, it has these points, and which looks like miniature Gans. And now we've achieved the ability to see this with using very sophisticated equipment has not been seen before. And so this becomes the heart of the earth matter, right? And so we question, is the earth matter transacted in singularity or duality? Well, it manifests in singularity, but it is a product of duality. So the singularity is the inertia density manifestation zone. And what is the cause of this? Prior to it manifesting in the physicality, we see that we can create a lot of earth Ganses, and each Gans is transacted in the same way, in singularity or duality. In other words, the Gans itself is a singular field, and that Gans has neighbors. And so those neighbors need to be conducive to the creation of that Gans. And the Gans that we create is not the same all over the world, because there's no two places with the same neighbors either. So all of this Gans production is a fragment of the complexity. It's all part of the nuclear feeding inertia. It gives you gravitational stability, but it also gives you dimensional portability. So you can move the various dimension points. So whether it be matter state, you have different points, antimatter state, different points, or the dark matter, which is the central point, and you have different points there. So you can pick any one plus any one plus any one, and you will get more than 3, because this nuclear feeding inertia continues. It doesn't stop. And even after you create the Gans. And so this is how, when we look at the elements on the periodic table of elements, we see the various range details, and we're only looking at a few of them, because what's important to us in this discussion is the amino acids, which is carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, in the medium of the sodium, potassium, calcium, or magnesium, and the manifestation of the copper, which is physical, and the zinc, which is emotional. Of course, the iron is very important, and so is the gold. And the gold has a special affinity, and why gravitate to silver when you can go for the gold? And this is the whole narrative of the Olympics, isn't it? Go for the gold. So, but only one can be the gold winner. The rest are not the gold winner. So when we look at the MAGRAV as a counterweight, we have to understand that it's a field captured in singularity. And so the nature of coming together has to have this angular momentum, the angular density. And we call it the fallen angels, but that's one concept, one point of view. We have another point of view, the arrived angels. You know, did you just drop out like a load falling off a truck? How many times have you heard? You know, it fell off the truck and I got a good deal. That's code for theft. And so this arriving or falling is passing through different flux lines of gravity. And so depending on how it comes through is the nature of what it is. But when we talk about these flux lines, we can see this in action when we look at the Gans counterweight, where you see sometimes in a beaker where you make the Gans, some of the Gans floats to the surface and some of the Gans goes to the bottom. And there's actions in two directions. So there is motion. And if you think of all the flux lines in the beaker, you see that the motion goes across these gradient transitions. And the steepness affects the transition gradient, how fast it moves. But fundamentally, the energy has to be dropped from one stage and given to the next stage. And in that way, there's a give and take and an exchange of energy. And if we're going up to the less dense, then that becomes magnetical. And if you're going down to the more dense, then that becomes gravitational. And so we refer to the magnetical as a negative and the gravitational as a positive. Okay, well, now we understand the radiance pole flipping because there is a vertical emission coming from the core. And so it reflects our polyatomic gradient transitioning where we're feeding as part of the radiance, the magnetical plasma. But in order for the magnetical plasma to move, it has to be magnetical. But in order for it to arrive, that magnetical plasma has to then become gravitational. So in essence, the pole has to flip. But it is still a magnetical plasma because from that flipping position, it has to revert back to a magnetical plasma with a magnetical characteristic to move again. And then eventually it becomes part of the feedback radiance. And so we find that the orbit around the plasma field is magnetical, but the core of the plasma field is gravitational. And so that becomes the essence of the energy in motion. But what we are ignoring is where does that external input come to facilitate the pole flipping? And so it's the cosmic ray feeding, which is coming from the universe. So as that energy becomes absorbed, that magnetical plasma then becomes more dense. It has more energy, so it becomes more gravitational. Therefore, the pole can flip and it can move. And then once it moves, it has exhausted that energy by giving to the next position. And it continues. So we find that the cosmic ray feeding is based on an emission and based on an absorption. And the emission and the absorption facilitate the MAGRAV stability. And so when you look at the Earth space and you find that outside of the magnetosphere, we have a vacuum. Well, how come we just don't explode? Because there's a counterweight, and that is the plasma core vacuum. So the vacuum inside and the vacuum outside, and we are working within the balance. And that balance for our physicality is in the balance of the Earth space field. And the Earth space field has the same characteristic. So the Earth space field vacuum is balanced by the vacuum of in-between space, which is outside of the magnetosphere, and the core space, which is inside the core, of the Earth and the planet. And so everything else is stable. But we operate in that zone, what we call the biosphere zone, which in the nearest proximity of the crust of the Earth. And in that point, we can operate because our vertical emission and our vertical absorption is working with the environment as our position and working with the cosmic rays, which is part of our feeding. So now we understand that in order for us to maintain our activity, there has to be an energy exchange, and it is continuous. Okay, so when we're looking at these exchanges, we have to understand that there's a whole lot of activity going on, like 250,000 transactions per second in each and every cell. And they gravitate from the transaction zones of the cosmic feeding coming together from various areas and the transaction zone of the magnetical radiation being in motion and the gravitational transaction zone at the core. And in order to maintain that and maintain its position, it has to continually transact with all the energy that is going around. So now we understand this radiance pole flipping that's going on all the time. But you notice that you are not doing any physical flipping. And you notice that the Earth is not doing any physical flipping in a rapid fashion, 250,000 times per second. It's just doing its energy flipping. And that energy flipping is allowing you to have that vitality. And this is all based on charge. So whether it's a point or whether it's a curve, we have to understand that it's a charge. And so last week we talked about shields as a charge because they represent this curvature. And so, of course, the focal point of the curvature is at the core and it extends outwards so that it reinforces the activity. But what's at the core is what you don't see is the gravitational charge, which is positive. So this is the method of energy exchange. And we see that when we're looking at a charge, the charge is always positive. So it's the emission that is negative, it's magnetical. It's the absorption that is positive, it's gravitational. And what affects the gradient is the rotation and the speed and the strength and the direction. So there's both an energy field going through the core and an energy field going through the perimeter, the orbit of the field. And so what we're focused on is the transaction zone, which is basically at the core. And then we say, well, it's just falling binding points are just coming together, and that's our arbitrary point of view. But what we don't see are the apparent ends, and they seem to be just terminal. They just seem to end somewhere, and we don't ask ourselves, what are they connected to? But we seem to have different binding points. And so we ask ourselves, how does that change? And so those are affected by the star inertia gradients, which are impacted by the 2 points of view that we have. We have a gravitational magnetical point of view and a magnetical gravitational point of view. And so one has a magnetical gradient charge and the other has a gravitational gradient charge. But each one has a susceptibility to increase or decrease. So when we're looking at the main transaction zone, it has the possibility of going through many, many points, and it can turn. And that creates your gravitational inertia point. And that seems to be the only thing that we give our time and attention to, ignoring the rest, like it's not there. But in plasma science, you can't do that. And in reality, we have to understand this concept of duality. We're talking about 2 points that work together in tandem, like a partnership. We call it the twinity. So when you have a transaction zone of the gravitational side, the star formation, you have two transaction zones which impact the inertia density manifestation. And then you have the same thing with the plasma fields. They also interact as a duality, and they also create the inertia density manifestation. But how dense is it? And then you look at the ray motion, and it does the same thing. And how dense is that? Well, not very dense at all, because we have the natural creation, which is a maggrav based on the natural creation and the natural decay. That's the range. But then we have another maggrav, the natural decay, which is a balance between the natural creation and the natural decay. So we have these two transaction zones that are coming together, and they create another transaction zone. This is the bonding area. And there's a boundary. There's a boundary between what we call the natural creation and the natural decay. And it all depends on the field strength, of which direction things will flow, and what we give our time and attention to. And if we don't understand that, then we just fudge that. And so we become the fudgers, because all we understand is that when two forces come together, there's a war. And so there's a susceptibility and a singularity. But if we could understand the fields of the universe, when fields come together in duality, they create this transaction zone. And we've seen that with the original magravs, where we had electric motors running Gans balls in a star formation, and they created this plasma field in the transaction zone. And we replicated that on May the 10th in Beijing, where we created gold. So the concept of the twinity is what we've been highlighting, the 2 points of the nanotech. And today we're talking about the 2 points of the picotech, which is really the 2 points of the star tech. So in the twinity, there's a twinity of the nanotech. We have to take those things into consideration. But from the nanotech, there's also the twinity of the Gans tech. And today we're talking about the twinity of the picotech. So how does that work? Same way. There's a polyatomic inertial gradient. But when we talk about the polyatomic, that is the movement from the atomic, which is a chain link, to the polyatomic, the nanocoating, which is not chained together, but it has a bonding field. And that bonding field is either going to be in relationship as a gravitational or a magnetical, so that that can continue along the copper wire. And so you have these various polyatomic inertia gradients, but they are all kind of round. And so in order to balance off, we have layers. We have nanocoating layers. And then we have gravitational layers as well in the Gans. And so that is creating our physicality. But we see the Gans as a gas, as a nanosolid. So how can a gas be a solid? Well, by the same discussion, how can a gas be a liquid? And so we know that that is possible. And we know that a liquid can be a solid also. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Gans is a nanosolid. So going back to our nano discussion, we see that it's monatomic particles on a copper substrate, and they align themselves. And when you look at that alignment, it is in interstitial layers, nesting like eggs in a carton. And then you have these monatomic layers. So the blue layer is not on the same level as the black layer, and they sit in the interstitial pockets. And so what are you creating? You're creating a star formation, and you're also creating a rotating field, and you're creating a six-pointed star as well. But if you look at the nanostate monatomic star formations, you find that the gravitational layer of the black has a magnetical point on the star of the blue. And then you look at the gravitational combination of the blue has a magnetical point on the black. And so what does that mean? That means you have this polar flipping, right? So when you look at the monatomic side view, you see that the star formation is in either direction. And then you have this synergy because now they're all organized and they're all working together. So 1 and 1 is more than 2 because you still have the 1 and the 1 and you're getting the product of the 1. Plus you're getting this monatomic energy flow, which is a superconductor at room temperature. Oh, well, isn't that wonderful? And, does anybody really care about that? Well, that is something that science has known, for decades and is only recently starting to talk about it. And we have been talking about that for a long time at the KAKT Foundation. But fundamentally, we have to understand what is the difference between the physicality and the animation. Well, more than 3 in a chain is a polymer. But when you have the fourth one in the physicality, it folds over and creates a protein. And so now we see that the relationship between the nano coating and the amino nanostate is that you have multiple monatomic energy flows coming. You have a direction, you have a negative, you have a positive, and it's a superconductor at room temperature. But now there's something in the core. And now there is a leanings towards the magnetical as opposed to the gravitational. But when the pole flips, so does the tendency to have the emission from the magnetical and the absorption to the gravitational, introducing the sine wave. There you go. So now we have a frequency. So when we're looking at the susceptibility and duality, as it relates to these Gans balls that are rotated with an electrical motor and the creation of this plasma field at the core, now we see that the rotating field that is going around is magnetical in every direction. But we were using the Gans, and the Gans was produced from the nanocoating. What is at the core? There is a Pico Gans in that core, but it is not a popcorn. The Gans is the popcorn. So if we understand surface to volume ratios, the tinier the object, the higher the negative charge. And then the more negative charges, the cumulative effect is basically additive. And so you have more negative charges. So one of the characteristics that allows the nanocoating, which is a superconductor at room temperature, and it's circular, to translate into Gans, which is an explosion of a point that we can now see in physicality. We know the Gans has a color. We've seen many, many Ganses. But the Gans itself has all these negative points, and they are all cumulative, and they're still at a superconductor at room temperature. So what did the Gans popcorn pop from? And why did it stop popping? I mean, like, it's an inertia density manifestation field, isn't it? So the way we talk about inertia is in conventional science an energy until it's redirected. So it'll continue to go until there is something stopping it. Well, what stopped the Gans popcorn from popping even more. So there must have been a balance. Where's the counterweight? Well, it seems like deep down in that transaction zone is that Pico Gans. Because what is different with the Pico Gans is that the Pico Gans is inside the nanocoating. So the Pico Gans is a counterweight to the Gans. So if we understand our physical state as being relayed by weight and our atomic state by mass, that is the gravitational measure. But when we look at the nuclear state, we measure that in Teslas, and the plasma state in time. That is the magnetical counterweight measure. So now we have a different understanding of this dynamic plasma relationship. So when we look at these two fields, the horizontal transmission and the vertical transition, and they come together, is the difference between the inner Earth space point within the inner Earth space field, which extends out to the magnetical transaction zone of the orbiting fields around the Earth. And so there's a balance therefrom. So when we talk about the creation of free plasma within ourselves, the basis is in the amino acid structure, the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. We call it the cone, COHN. And that is fundamental for the creation of life. And so there's a structure within that structure. So each star formation is a magnetical point. And the combination create this gravitational transaction zone in the center. And this is all a superconductor at room temperature. And so we have this technology, and some people can actually see it. So we look at the auras of the soul of physicality, and they express our emotions in color. And what these colors are is an encapsulation of our emotion at that point in time. And there are overlapping fields. And so because we can't see them, we create this invisibility shield. It's a shield by illusion. But those who are clairvoyant can see these auras. And so you become exposed. And they can tell if you're lying. So you don't want to go into a poker game with a clairvoyant because you can't bluff. And that's the same is true with the universal community, because poker playing is impossible with the universal community because they don't look at the cards that you're holding. They're just looking at your intention. And liars, cheaters, stealers, and murderers are not welcome. And how they deal with it is you become very lonely. So, what they're looking at is the inside containment. And inside the skin of the body is the Gans. And so when you're looking at a stone, inside is, well, more stone. So the outside of the stone becomes the fence of that field. That becomes the Coulomb barrier. And we have a Coulomb barrier of the Earth, and that becomes our plasma barrier. So the plasma barrier of any field could be considered a Coulomb barrier, but the Coulomb barrier as we know it is specific to the physicality. The plasma barrier is specific to a field, and there's a non-containment because there is no fence. There is just a Magrav condition that is in balance. So when we look at the rotating Ganses and we look at the cup, we see that the glass acts as a shield. We're looking from the top down in the left picture. We can see that there's a Gans at the bottom of the cup. and there's a big fat hole in the center. And so the cup itself becomes the Coulomb barrier shield. But what's shielding the hole in the middle from the rest of the Gans? And you look at the cup on the right, and not only do you have one field, but you have another field. So you have overlapping fields. So then you have multiple barrier shields. So what is the limit to these things? Well, when you look at the twinity of life, our physicality is a physical inertia field of connection. And so our existence in physicality acts as our Coulomb barrier shield. And with respect to the environment, that assists us in that shielding process. And so when those things work together, and we refer to that as a pistol, then that is our refugium, that is our protection, that is how we exist, and that continues. It always continues because you cannot stop it. Energy is always in motion. So when we look at the planetary relationships, we have to think of the relationship of the electron and the proton. The electron being magnetical and the proton being gravitational, and they come together. And so, depending on the type of light that we see, it is either translucent or it is transparent. And then we can see that each physicality has its own mag-grav position. So whether it's the sun or the earth or the Mars or me, each of them is a mag-grav, and each of them is a containment field, and each of them is overlapping the other within our solar system. And of course, now we have visitors within that solar system, and they were using the sun as a shield because they're hiding behind the sun and issuing up a superconducting charge. That was something truly amazing, more than we could imagine. And so now we have to face the reality that the Coulomb barrier of the Earth would not have been enough. We needed a stronger force, so we used the sun as a shield. The sun became our Coulomb barrier, and thank God for that. So we find that the sun shield is a physical barrier because we found that 3I Atlas was hiding behind the sun, and when it went through its physical manifestation, the sun was a barrier of that physical manifestation. So 3I Atlas was able to expand its field as a Gans popcorn. And it did that from a Pico position. But it didn't continue. It hit a counterweight position, which was its own Coulomb barrier shield, if you will, and that was in the non-physical state, right? And R2 Swan had the same thing, except that R2 Swan was even bigger, and it used the same process. So now you understand how significant our sun is. So now we can understand on the 603rd Knowledge Seeker workshop how this vertical alignment went through and how the path link and susceptibility was affected between the soul of physicality, and the physicality. It manifested an infinity loop. And so that infinity loop created a field. That field was the inertia field emission. The emission is what leads to this threshold crossing because the mag-grav was maintained. So the green path was maintained, And through that maintenance, there's an emission through the red path. And there you go. So now we understand how the Gans flowed in water. Why? Because Gans has an affinity to give and take energy, and so does water. Water can exchange energy, and it can give and take energy. So the giving is to exchange magnetical energy, and the taking is to exchange gravitational energy. And this is what we have to understand as this being the reality of our existence. So the gravitational intensity is the attraction, and that is part of our feedback because that's what we know. But the repulsion is part of our magnetical intensity, and that is part of the feeding. And that is also part of what we know. What we have to understand is that the two are working together. And so, just like the electron and the neutron, you can clearly see the difference here. So, when we look at the Keystone reactor, we have to understand that as a shield, that is a dimension point. But as a star position, that too is a dimension point. And as a possession, in this case, Mr. Goldfinger, that is a dimensional point. But what are we talking about here? When we look at crop circles, we still seem to not understand where they came from. But if we are looking at it as knowledge seekers, we find that each rotating field is the magnetical part. And at the core is the gravitational part. So if we look at the rotating magnetical field and its physicality being large, you could say that that is the Gans-like. And when you look at the core gravitational field, you could say that it's Pico-like. And so what we're looking at, the rotating field in the center, in between the Pico Gans and the Gans, that field is round. It doesn't seem to have any points. But when you look at the field on the outside, the large rotating field, it has a lot of points. What is instructive is that if you count these points, you will find that there are two overlapping fields. And each overlapping field has 7 points. Now, when you look at the star formation in the center, it only has 3 points. The fourth point being the magnetical point of the star formation. Well, that magnetical point manifests into the Pico point at the plasma core. Now, that field is spherical. So the gravitational point in the core is the spherical representation of this two-dimensional diagram. And when you look at these points on the outer field, what is instructive is that there are 7 points. But there's a second angular rotating field, and it too has 7 points. And if you add up all the points, it comes out to 14 points. We'll have to discuss that later because what is really interesting is that when we talked about the Great Flood, we talked about the 7 civilizations. And all the civilizations had the same story of the Great Flood. And so what is common is there are many points on that star formation because it's not just one point on the star formation, but there's 8 billion points. And each of us has a Pico point. if you think about it, you don't want to get hurt in that process. Because now you see, excuse me, now you see how the inertia highway works. There's the carbon 12, carbon 14, carbon 16. But there's a counterweight in the background. And when you look at that counterweight in the background, there's another field. What are we giving our time and attention to? Are we giving attention to ourselves? How can you exist in a community by yourself? So there's unity within the community. And then you have your own inner space unity of all the cells. And you have your mental and your physical construct. And there's a bounding zone between there. And you have your soul and your consciousness, and there's a bounding zone between there. And you have the energy and the intention, and there's a bonding zone between there. And so each of us is translating that at the binding zone. So the energy as it travels, we call it the principal matter, the PM ticks, and they're magnetical. They're an energy parceling unit that is delivering energy, and it is diluting in strength to create the antimatter, dark matter, and matter gen. And this is all converging into the plasma gen. And at that point, it converts into a plasma. But in order to manifest, it has to have a field interaction within the environment. And that becomes a maggrav of its own. And at that point, it becomes gravitational. And there you have your physical manifestation. So let's understand. Two plasmas come together. No two plasmas are the same. And they create this dimension point in that transaction zone. So coming together, and one is magnetical, one is gravitational, and that is the construct. You have to have both. And the gravitational confirmation is in the emission of light that's crossed that threshold. And we see this anomaly where oxygen is a non-visible gas, but in its position, it says, well, it can emit a fingerprint spectrum, a color spectrum, and it's unique. And you know that it's oxygen. And so that allows us to view oxygen everywhere in the universe by converting that fingerprint into an emission of color spectrum. And that's how we can do this gravitational tracking. So that energy is always coming together. And so our existence is fundamentally in the matter plasma dimensions, which constitutes our physicality. We can touch and we can see it, and we say, well, there you are, and that's what you are. But that's the gravitational aspect. What we need to understand is that there's a magnetical field that you can touch or you can see, and it is also part of our matter plasma. And so man is feedback dominant, not recognizing the feeding aspect of it. So our impression of what we have is based on what our neighbors have. Which is kind of unfortunate because your neighbor will always have more than you, right? Especially if you steal it from them. Why make more than they do? You just take what they have and then they have less. And so this is the plasma matter dilemma, how we transfer energy from this plasma state to the Gans state, to the nano state, to the atomic state and back, and interact on the left side and the right side of the equation. And every one of these become a transaction zone. And they're all different, just like we are all different. but we're all part of the humanity species. So how could we all be the same and still be all different? Well, that is why. So our existence on this planet is based on supplementation that's due to consumption. And our consumption is information and knowledge. And we find, well, that's an acquired knowledge. So one of the ways we can do that is by living. Life is for learning. But then we also have this teachings by the ancient teachers. Do we understand that that is a conditional teaching? They just teach us what they want us to know. But the Creator wants us to know everything. There's an unconditional teaching. And so with this new awareness, we find that we have a deficiency. And what we have to do is we have to cross that historical threshold between the cosmic feeding and the loosh harvesting, because that loosh harvesting is man's burden. In the 604th Knowledge Seekers Workshop, we see that there's a relationship between the soul and the physicality, and it has to cross the threshold of the soul of physicality. And so our representation of our physicality is from the point of view of the soul of physicality, forgetting, of course, that the soul is the source of that intention and that energy and everything else. So as we head into uncharted territory, it looks like it's a Pico dimension, because we find that there are many stars beyond the nano-monatomic state. And we are with the herd at that turning point where we see the range of energy going from decay to radiation, where the decay is the disintegration of the mag-grav condition, and the radiation implying that there's a disintegration through explosion of the mag-grav condition. Well, we are the AI. We are the ancestral intelligence. We are the technology. And that technology is the inertia product of our physicality. We are the image of our dimensional convergence point. This is a new understanding of the new science, because it's not really new. It just shows you that energy is portable. So the energy state transition can either be elevation, which is the physical matter state, to the energy state, or inertia, which is the energy state to physical matter state. So when we talk about elevation, that involves expansion from the Pico popcorn to the Gans popcorn. It's just that the Pico has not popped. So the dynamic soul initiator is at the core. That's the soul of the Creator, the soul of the earth, the soul of the family of humanity, the soul of man, the soul of the body, or the soul of the cells. There's no translation needed. All are at the Pico core. These are all part of the soul food that's available to us. All we have to do is plug into the Creator and tune into the cosmic rays so that we can turn on that energy and drop out of our resistance and receive that particular inertia point. So we have to provide the pattern, and then we can get the energy. And so what you create is what you receive. And so let's enlarge our schemes so that we can be more, do more, and act towards the greater oneness, and suddenly transcend the limitations of nuclear science, as we have been trying to do 616 weeks in a row with the Knowledge Seekers workshops. The teaching continues, doesn't stop. The Gans has an affinity of truth. And so we went from the nano coding to the Pico coding to the Gans, from diamonds to gold. And now we're producing it by the tons, the same way the earth produced it. We don't have to rob, cheat, and steal and kill for it. So we're on the verge of a massive technology release, because this planet was not working properly. It's hard to sleep when our beds are burning. So the rescue is afoot. The scientific, financial, political, and preservation rescue. that is represented by our consumption rescue, understanding the creation. That is the ultimate rescue. So that when we look at our physical affinity and we see that we are emotionally charged, that's our Gans ball. And that comes from the twinity of the Pico tech. Things are popping. There's the One Nation Network, which is opening the blinds of One Nation Network at a time. And that time is now, because peace and prosperity is due on this planet. And it is overdue. That's why our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. We want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to the lack of knowledge. There's a world peace treaty. That's the only way that we can join the universal community. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of the carbon nations, learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. That World Peace Treaty is something that we choose, sign it unconditionally, mean it sincerely. The point of the true Gans tech is to cross these polyatomic boundaries. The wars on Earth space do not translate across the peace dome. Is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? Well, it's time to learn that the history of self has a different complexion in the universal context, because the Gans is a peaceful superconductor of true intentions. And the Pico Gans is that tiny giant of fields of each of the matter state, plasma state, and the universal state. And this is why the plasma science is delivered daily and needs to continue via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to that new golden outer space age. And I thank you all for staying with me on this trip. I hope you had fun. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. And hopefully you're not going to be testing us on this in the short term. I don't think I would pass that test. There's so much you've shared with us today. But let's see, I don't see any questions in the chat, but maybe someone has a question or something they'd like to clarify. You keep referring to Pico Gans, but I thought Gans is more of a special class between matter state and plasma and above the level of Pico. When we make a CO2 box, do we have Pico materials in there? Maybe we are producing a Gans of Pico, but I'm thinking it's just the field dimension. You've mentioned Pico Gans. And we know we can make a Gans of anything if you know how to play, but is the Pico material made into a Gans? Just a point of clarification.
And that is an important point. So I was of the same opinion as what you just said. The thing that I couldn't rationalize was the fact that the nanocoating was small and the Gans coating was large. And the point being is that the only way you could see the nanocoating was with the multiple layers. So, but 40,000 layers, that gave you the blackness. But, there's different shades of blackness. And so that means, 40,000 is not the limit. You can go 100,000 layers. It all depends on how you continue the process. But when you get down to something so tiny, so the only way we could see the nanocoating, which is 10 to the minus sixth, was to see the nanocoating is 10 to the minus ninth. The only way to see that is with the multiple layers. So you needed thousands of layers to see it. but the Pico is 1,000 times smaller, 3 orders of magnitude smaller, 10 times 10 times 10. So we didn't know what it looked like. We thought that the nanocoating was round, but then we see that it's like a diamond. Well, diamond is carbonate. Carbonate has 8 points. So then when we look at the Pico, and we finally could see that, we needed a special equipment to see that. And it had many points, way more than 8. But we needed a special equipment to see that. The Gans you can just see with the naked eye. So therefore, the Gans itself is not 10 to the minus 12th, but it's 10 to the positive 12th in terms of energy. So therefore, there is a balanced counterweight between the Gans popcorn and the Pico popcorn because the pattern is the same. And you can ascertain, you can look under the microscope and you will see that the Gans has many points. And how often have we talked about the carbon 12? So more than 8, the carbon 14, the carbon 16, right on up to the carbon 60. That's 60 points. Did we count the number of points on the Pico point? Did we count the number of points on the Gans point? Are you really able to see one Gans? Has anybody ever seen one Gans? Or just because there's a whole bunch of Gans, all of a sudden we can see it, just like the multiple layers of the nanocoating? Well, if the Gans is a nanosolid, then nanosolid means it's 10 to the minus 9th. But the energy it is giving is 10 to the plus 9th. It's a superconductor. So really, we can't see the nanocoating until it has multiple layers. We can't see the Pico coating because it's tiny and it's in the heart of the nano star formation. So are we deluding ourselves that we can see the Gans? Or is it because of the multiple layers of the Gans that we can see it? So I think we've come to the point in realization that when you get into the micro world, that is below 10 to the minus 6th, there's a whole different science going on.
Right.
Aye, aye.
Yep. That may be for a future time. He said we did have to go in that direction, and maybe they are going in there now. But I remember a statement. The creator is small, weak, and a giver. So I'm starting to understand that the creation is not coming from the big down to the small. It's actually building up from very, very small and weak fields into something that can manifest in the matter state. That's just the way I'm seeing it.
Before you go
Small,
to,
weak, and a giver.
so before you go to Ike, that description that you just made applies directly to the Pico Gans.
Yeah. Okay. Come right in, Ike. You don't have to raise your hand. And I think Gail wanted more explanation as well.
Um,
Please.
yeah, Alex, so in a sense, right, I understand Pico is minus 12, right?
Yes.
Okay, Nano is minus 9. Is that correct?
Yes.
Then in terms of, we're looking at it, measure, it says the smallest. So let's assume Pico has to have a high energy in terms of, if you're looking at something very high, starting from that position, so Pico should be of the highest energy.
Right.
Okay, in that, if it's of the highest energy compared to nano, explain to me how is it able to hold like a storage? If something is of high strength, I would think it would be ready to burst. But how is it able to hold at that position? And knowing that magnetic fields travel. So if it's starting from the initial point and then keep moving forward to where we understand that Pico, okay, is a higher strength, and then nano is another strength that is lower. But how is that able to hold in that storage? How can that hold so much storage at that point? How is it possible? Any science behind it?
Well, I think if you've ever had a flat tire, I think you can understand that when your tire is flat, you can inflate it by absorbing more air. But the reason the tire was flat was because it was losing air, emitting air, in other words. So the conformity of the tire remains, but whether it's flat or inflated is dependent on the rate of emission of the air and the rate of inflation. So in terms of physicality, we don't really have a tire that can inflate and deflate itself as it's driving along. It either goes flat or it's fully inflated. In the plasma state, a maggrav condition is either giving or taking energy, but it's doing both simultaneously because energy is always in motion. So when you're looking at that Pico, based on surface to volume ratio, it has an enormously high negative charge, which means it's giving. But in terms of its position, it's in the gravitational location at the core. So that core is maintained because it can emit that energy. And so it can emit and absorb energy simultaneously as a giver, but it doesn't deflate because it's also a taker. And that's the nature of a maggrav. So the Pico can do it, the Nano can do it, the Gans can do it, you can do it. And that is the nature of the plasma science, the giving and the taking simultaneously to maintain that maggrav position of field containment.
And also there's other sizes lower than Pico, right?
Well, how small is small?
That's imagination then.
Yeah, well, you have to understand that we are measuring in terms of physicality, aren't we?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So in the sense that if we get into that energy world, then that's another dimension to understand, because this is just physicality. Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Ike.
Gail, did you want to ask something? I think you were curious about something. Maybe she can't come to her mic. Oh,
I
yeah.
can. I've
Yes.
just started using my computer, so I have to learn new things.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Uh, I I'm just checking. When Ike was talking now, it's becoming very, very small and gives a lot, but I keep thinking of the Earth. And so my question was what you did a while back on density. and the strength of the gravitational is very, very large, and the energy is very large, the denser and smaller that it becomes. So as it becomes pico, it becomes extremely powerful. And then, but not, it's not really the matter state. It's energy pure. So how, I sort of was trying to think, when we talk about E is equal to M. So that means that if we get towards the pico, then how high does that go? I mean, it's almost infinitely powerful. Am I in the wrong direction or
No, I
what?
think you're talking like Mr. Kesh now.
That will be the day. But we all have to, according to Mr. Kesh, we will eventually start to talk like him.
Yes, absolutely. It is exciting to hear people start to explain their understanding or a little bit more. All of these things have been formed. This is part of the perhaps new language that's being introduced to the planet as well.
Yeah, we're in kindergarten, but we're doing really well. I think we're out of creche. That's what they call it here.
So even
So,
at this small state of Pico, it's giving, but it's also taking at the same time. As we say, there's no giving without taking, so that's happening. It's just at such a minute level, and there's probably, as Mr. Kesh said, there's levels below the Pico, I believe, and that will be a teaching more and more into the future, or maybe it's coming now. As he said, these Pico chips are coming into reality and making the quantum almost like a horse and buggy. This quantum science, he said, will have very little relevance, so unimportant in the future as we continue to progress into this understanding of creation.
Mark, are you able to hear well without any interruption?
Absolutely, this is the clearest
That
voice
I'm
we've
so
had.
glad my computer is working.
And we're not getting that feedback. So you can leave your mic open on that system. It's not interfering whatsoever.
Yeah, it'll be much easier.
Yes, yes.
Hmm. Thank goodness for that. Oh, okay. That's so I don't know if I have anything more to say on this. Oh yeah, when we were talking about the energy is equal to the mass. So in my head, okay, I've got the picture of the Earth and all the very basic core of the Earth creates all the different gravitational and magnetical fields, and they interact and they produce our magnetosphere at the end of the day. And when I looked at a picture, I think we were talking with Jalal, you have the gravitational, and it's quite large. And then you have even beyond that, the magnetical, which ends up being like a magnetosphere. So the size of the gravitational is it really, really small compared to the size of the field of the magnetical, and therefore your mass is very, very small. That's my question.
Alex, also going back to when you said how small is too small, what is there a limit in terms of the physicality? If you have okay, let's start with large to small, and I know 1 meter, and then 1 milli is -3, going down smaller. We have micro, -6. I think we have nano, -9, and pico, where we are -12. So I assume there has to be I believe Mr. Kesh said femto and atto, which is negative 15 and 18. So at what point would it flip back to out of this physical scale that we know? Because if you come to large, we have kilo, we have billion and others, trillion, it goes forward. We don't know until we get to that point, then we have that scale. But for the smallest and the smallest, for Pico, if I visualize it, it could be the size of an atom. Nano, we always know is the size like a viruses, that there's a whatever. Then micro, we have the hair, inside diameter of the hair, the micro. But beyond Pico, going down to negative, from negative 12 to negative 24, 20. Is that a limit? Is that another, I mean, where is the limit before it gets to energy world or plasma world or something? Do you know of any scale like that?
Well, I don't have access to classified information, or I'm not part of the research, so I can't answer that question. I'm just Joe Muck and Fudge, like everybody else. And the thing is that it only stands to reason that, it would be possible. It's like you play on a piano and you say, well, there are 88 keys and the highest note, is like right up there. But is that the highest note? Because there are harmonics. So the highest note has a frequency, but the harmonics are multiples of that frequency. And so are the harmonics like what we call tonality, and the timbre are, a Stradivarius violin, they're not just talking about the music that it creates, but they're talking about the timbre, the tonal quality, and all of these attributes that they're applying to sound that, isn't translated so much as frequency as it is translated as emotional language. So we already know that music conveys a language, but if you listen to a song on a mono station and you listen to one on a stereo station, you get a different point of view of that same music. And then as you enhance the quality, you start to get more that fulfills the image. It becomes a more complete image. However you want to use that as an analogy, you come to a restaurant and they'll just give you a burger. Another restaurant will give you a burger on a bun. And another one will say, well, we're going to give you, all the trimmings. So every one of them feeds you, but each one has a different kind of quality. And we have been settling for the lowest quality, because we almost become, grateful for the crumbs, because we are dealing with intermediaries who are feeding us on a conditional basis. Yeah, you can get satisfied with, just eating, a bunch of something. You can just eat a bowl of rice and you can get fed. But that's not a 5-course meal.
So in a sense, if we increase our soul strength, then we can open up this knowledge to where we can observe the smaller of the smaller of the smallest of, because right now that's just the limit that we know. But as we increase our strength, our soul strength, and then there's other opportunities for us to move further to the tiniest of the tiniest of the tiniest.
Well, the thing is that we don't have the physical ability to manage that. Okay. So, most of us are having just, difficulty navigating a car. Uh, when you have 73 trillion cells in your body and they are functioning at 250,000 transactions per second, so 250,000 times 73 trillion, that's a big number. I don't know what that number is, but I think your basic calculator wouldn't be able to handle it.
Right.
And who cares? Okay, all what you care is that you can get up out of the chair and go to the washroom when you have to, or go and caress your special person in your life. So this is you're not discussing, say, oh, okay, it's your turn, kidney, and by the way, the heart is still drumming, and don't forget the spleen. I mean, gee whiz, don't ever forget the spleen. My God, I'm sorry, pancreas. Please don't get angry. You know, I I have preference. It's just like the Smothers Brothers. Mom always liked you best. So that doesn't work that way. The soul is unconditional and gives to all members of the body, and that's 73 trillion. And that's what we understand in the physicality. But what about the twinity that supports those 73 trillion? Well, the thing is, we can count that trillion when we have a cadaver, because that is actually in a Gans state. As a cadaver, it translates into a physical state. Why? Because it's the lowest energy. The life force essence has left that cadaver. So, really what we're counting is the residue. So inside our bodies, we are having a different state of vitality. So you can't say that, oh, it's a specific number. Once you hit that number, well, you're alive. Well, we know that there are people who are barely alive, and there are people who are like the life of the party, and they're, overly energetic. So this uniqueness that each of us has is our ability to interpret these plasma fields. And it is affected by our susceptibility to accept and to employ and to integrate with this energy. And when we resist and we say, I want it my way, great, go right ahead, knock yourself out. And I hope you have a lot of fun. But, when you say, well, let's look at it this way, or let's look at it that way, you know what? Let's look at it the right way. The right way is the energy is always in motion. So you have to decide what it is that you're giving your time and attention to. You think all of us are here fooling around, sitting here wasting our time? This meeting is recorded. This meeting will be repeated. And all of us have in our memory our presence here today. And when your grandchildren ask you, well, where were you when things changed? I was there. I was there. And this is one of the proudest moments that we could have. A lot of people, just have a proud moment that, well, I was there at my daughter's wedding. That was the proudest moment in their life. Well, we were here when humanity joined the universal community. We have already joined. The universal community is absolutely begging us to join them because they too are in a deficiency. Everybody wants the family to come together. It's just a few miscreants, hanging on to failings and weaknesses of the human spirit and dominating. Well, that domination is fragile. And what we have to do is become aware of that and then bring about that physical, practical application of our knowledge. We've tried many, many times, and we haven't been successful. But life teaches you how to do things. So if we do things the same way, which is through war, we'll get the same result. So automatically we know that is the wrong way to go about it. And that killing has to stop. Back to you, Mark, please.
Sorry, Alex. I just wanted to reiterate again, the pictures from the book of the Earth and the core and the gravitational fields that come up along with the magnetical fields. Do we have a huge group? I'm looking at the picture you've got. To me, the gravitational fields, even if they are smaller, they're much more powerful because they're more dense. I may be wrong, that's for sure. And the magnetical is outgoing, and they all come from the same source in the middle and interact with so many other fields. So if I look at at our, like for example, this one, I am assuming that the magnetical is not as strong as gravitational, even though it looks like gravitational is smaller, maybe. But the power of gravitation, I mean, if you look at the density, it would be enormous. Is that, or if I got the right idea or not?
Yeah, yes, you do. And that's where the confusion comes in, because the higher energy is the giver. So the, higher energy gives to the lower energy. So the gravitational is the higher energy, and it gives to the lower energy the magnetical. As that gravitational energy gets absorbed by the magnetical, now the magnetical can give. And the balance of the magnetical is based on the number of points, if you want to talk in those terms, compared to the number of points in the gravitational. So there's one point in the gravitational at the core and multiple points of the magnetical. So each individual magnetical is a fragment of the whole, right? Each one is a fragment of the complexity. So each and every magnetical has the matter, antimatter, dark matter dimension point, but they're not at the same strength as the gravitational. And the gravitational has to maintain its continual ability to feed. Since the gravitational is an inertia field, it is able to continue this nuclear feeding. But how does it get fed? Does the magnetical of that field feed the gravitational? No. No, then you're a dog chasing your tail and you get nowhere. Okay, so the magnetical energy is to feed others, and the gravitational is absorbed from others still. And that manifestation comes from the cosmic rays. That's from here. So when we're looking at the picture of our plasma core, we're not seeing the cosmic ray feeding. So what we are doing as a KAKT Foundation in terms of our research, and Mark Ray in terms of our practical application of that research, is we are applying the technology in a practical way of the cosmic ray feeding. So why have an intermediary? Why let the earth produce the gold and then we have to get our pickaxes to get the gold? Why don't we just say, well, Earth, thanks for teaching us how to do this. We're going to do it the same way. Why not? The Earth is an inertia density manifestation. We are an inertia density manifestation as well. So we can do the same thing. We can create gold the same way that the earth creates the gold.
As long as we create this same condition that would apply, for example, in China in the mountains. So as long as you provide that kind of condition, then you will get the gold.
Well, the condition is unconditionality. That's the condition.
I mean, I know gold fields are in certain positions on the earth due to the environment at that point.
So we have an ability to manifest that environment.
Anywhere. Okay.
So we can take the environment with us. If we can
Mm-hmm.
take the environment with us, then we can take our physicality with us. And
Yes.
ergo, we can enter into outer space, which according to conventional science has never been done because they still measure the distance to the stars in light years.
Which is matter state. Okay. Hmm. All
Thanks,
right.
thank you very much, Gail, for your assistance in this.
I'm still thinking. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Since they don't have a mouth and they don't have a stomach, how are they, if they do manifest, again, Mr. Kesh said we'll see, how are they going to communicate with us without a mouth? And again, I think this will help with the understanding of the feeding and take. I think this is our biggest defense, is to take other creatures, whether it's a nut or an apple, and kill it and consume it in a way. This is our biggest defense. But how are they going to communicate with us with no mouth? We won't hear any spoken words. It'll be all zero time type communication. Will they, because Mr. Kesh indicated they had sent communication, is there a special device that they'll bring with them allowing communication or
Emotions.
okay?
We can you use your emotions and then you can convert it to what you are used to, or they will convert it to what we are used to. So it all depends.
Okay.
Because that's
If
the
they're
energy. Go ahead.
No, if they're, I think this will help in the eating as well. How did they trap? This will create a lot of consternation for mankind. How did they travel for millions or thousands of years? We know it goes on a 3,000 trip without actually consuming food. But yet they still appear to be in great shape. Their intelligence is certainly not lacking behind man. So I think this will help us. Maybe they'll explain more about the ethos, because how are you going to travel around the universe with no mouth and no stomach to digest anything? This is going to cause a huge, as I said when I first heard Mr. Kesh said you can feed yourself without eating, I said there's no way I could possibly imagine how this can be done. Now we're going to have actual specimens, or maybe they'll allow themselves to be studied in conjunction with explaining the reason why they have no mouth and no stomach. Certainly, they've met the, if it's thinking, speaking, and acting without a mouth, you certainly can't speak. Of course, you can still think, but they haven't offended in that way, so to speak. I'm not sure.
It's all
I mean,
filled.
you already do it
Yeah.
when you think about another person and then you end up communicating with them in one way or the other. So you can communicate without opening your mouth. You can definitely think the thoughts, and like Ike said, you have your emotions that can feel that for sure.
So no
Right.
mouth, no teeth.
You don't need that.
No, that's what we know here in this physicality. But we have the trees. They're still standing for thousands of years, so they absorb fields. They don't have mouths or teeth,
Mhm.
so but they're able to absorb fields and still stay healthy. So you can translate that to other organisms from out of any place. It's all about fields. They know how to absorb fields. So our mouth and our teeth and these are all the dimensions for us here. And that's why we are murderers. We try to grab and chew. But if we're able to absorb fields, and then we already do that, 80% of our energy comes from fields absorption. So it's just the 20% that we are used to chewing and killing and doing all that.
So probably those images of reptilians with very large stature and very big mouths and teeth that are dripping with saliva, that's probably all made up. What would they need that for?
Fiction.
Or it's used again to protect themselves. If you saw an entity like that, certainly you would not try to challenge it. I'm thinking that is another way of them manifesting in a way that causes us, like the skunk, as I said in the past. When you see a skunk, you certainly don't want to cross their path. You go in a different direction. So I'm thinking because these entities are rather shy and rather peaceful, sometimes they may allow us to see them as something that we wouldn't want to interact with off the bat, let's say. We can see that they're more powerful than we are physically, or what appears to be a physicality.
Think of chameleons. They change color as you come in. They change to the environment, to what, as a defense mechanism. So if they can able to do that and they are here, imagine what other intelligent technologies can do. So they could be disappearing and appearing in front of us, but we would think it's something different.
I think they will. I actually, and Mr. Kesh said, we have the ability to do that, to balance the fields with the environment. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm still here, but I've sort of blended in or balanced with the fields of my environment. So I think we're in for a lot of shocking surprises coming up. And again, it's beautiful to know these people are very considerate. They're not aggressive, and we have a connection with them. So we're about to, again, this is going to be shocking for many circles on this planet, but I think they'll get over it. Anyone else have a thought, a question, a comment?
Thank you all for allowing me to continue to present, and I'm hopeful that you're all enjoying this. It's it's my point of view and how I interpret things, and I'm just trying to offer suggestions on how we can discuss with our neighbors. But please remember, in your own capability and your own understanding, and you don't have to understand the nuts and bolts. You just have to look at the results and understand that you already have abundant knowledge, because you've already survived so many things on this planet, and they've basically thrown everything at us, and we still keep on coming. So we are the indomitable spirit. Please carry on. Thank you so much.